On winter nights when the wind howled like a starving creature across the empty fields, medieval families would gather around a fire that barely looked like a fire at all, a slow, smouldering glow rising from something that was not wood, not logs, not anything we would recognize as fuel today. Yet it was this strange, almost secret resource that kept entire villages alive when the world outside fell to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. A cold so deep it turned breath into crystals and froze water inside wooden buckets before morning. It is comforting for us to imagine winter as an inconvenience solved with a switch, a delivery, or a short trip to the nearest store. But in the long, brutal centuries of medieval Europe, especially during what we now call the Little Ice Age, winter was not a season but a force that pressed against the walls of every cottage, a dark and relentless adversary that lasted 8 months and respected no one, from the poorest peasant to the most experienced farmer, and the only real protection was fire. A fire that almost no one could afford to build in the way we imagine fires today, because the forests that once covered Europe were disappearing, claimed by lords who guarded even fallen branches as their private property, leaving ordinary people with choices so desperate that they learned to burn things we would never dream of putting into a hearth. And it is within this dim, smoky world that tonight's story unfolds. A story of families who survived the cold, not with firewood, but with the strangest fuels imaginable, resources gathered from bogs, from animals, from the very earth beneath their feet, fuels that turned garbage into warmth and necessity into invention, fuels that kept children alive through nights when the frost moved across the walls like creeping glass, and every breath felt like swallowing snow. To understand how they reached for these unusual fuels, we must first understand how firewood, the most basic element of warmth, became a luxury so scarce that a single cart of it could cost more than a labourer earned in an entire week, forcing peasants to turn toward survival methods that feel almost unthinkable to us today. Before medieval people ever thought of burning peat, or gorse, or dung, or bones, they lived in a world where firewood was as fundamental as water, a resource woven into the very structure of their lives, because wood was not just something to burn for comfort, it was the material from which homes were built, tools were made, fields were cultivated, and meals were prepared, and every passing year, as families grew and villages expanded, the pressure placed on Europe's ancient forests intensified in a way that slowly, silently created a crisis no one was prepared for. In the early medieval centuries, forests still stretched for miles, a wild green expanse that seemed endless to the people who lived beside them. But as populations climbed and farmland pushed outward, trees fell in staggering numbers, and by the 11th and 12th centuries great swaths of Europe had already been cleared, not by kings or armies but by farmers trying to feed their families, carving new fields from what had once been dense woodland, believing, as people often do, that the forest would simply always be there. Yet the land was changing faster than anyone realized, and as woods shrank, the value of what remained rose sharply, creating a new kind of power: forest ownership, a privilege guarded by nobles, bishops, and wealthy landholders who declared vast stretches of woodland to be the king's forest, not meaning that it belonged to the king personally, but that it was placed under a strict legal system designed to protect game animals for aristocratic hunts, a system so rigid that even gathering fallen branches, something as harmless as picking up a stick from the ground, could be considered a crime unless a peasant had formal permission known as est over rights. Imagine the frustration of a family living at the very edge of a forest, watching the branches sway in the winter wind, knowing that warmth was only a few steps away, yet understanding that those trees were forbidden, patrolled by armed foresters whose duty was not to protect people from the cold, but to protect the Lord's rights from the people who needed the wood most. And so gathering fuel became a dangerous act, an act filled with risk because punishments were severe, ranging from heavy fines that could ruin a family to brutal physical penalties. And although hanging was reserved mostly for deer poaching, The fear of being caught taking wood was very real. This situation alone would have been enough to create hardship. But nature herself soon made the problem far worse. For beginning in the 14th century, the climate shifted into a colder, harsher pattern, the Little Ice Age, a period when summers shortened, crops failed more often, and winters arrived early and stayed long. So long that rivers like the Thames froze solid enough to hold markets and festivals, while glaciers in the Alps crept downward and swallowed entire villages, pressing people into conditions that no one had experienced in generations. And in these bitter winters, when the temperature fell to 30 degrees Fahrenheit and remained there for weeks, the demand for fuel rose to desperate levels, but the supply, restricted by law and dwindling forests, could not meet even a fraction of the need. In cities, a cartload of firewood cost more than many families earned in 7 days, and in the countryside the poorest villagers often spent entire days gathering scraps of brush, twigs, and anything that could produce even the smallest flame. Yet even this was not enough, because medieval houses were draughty, built with thin walls, gaps in the timbers, and floors that let the cold seep upward like a living thing, meaning that without a constant fire glowing through the night, the frost could settle inside the home, creeping along the edges of the bed and across children's blankets, until survival itself became uncertain. Thus, long before medieval people turned to desperate fuels, long before peat or gorse or dung or bones filled their hearths, there was this fundamental crisis, this slow tightening of resources, this invisible pressure created by deforestation, harsh climate and rigid social laws, a pressure that forced families to look beyond wood toward anything, truly anything, that might burn long enough to keep their loved ones alive through one more night of unrelenting cold. Before medieval peasants ever turned to burning the strange fuels that surprise us today, there existed a solution so elegant, so efficient, and so deeply rooted in ecological wisdom that if used widely, it could have prevented almost every winter crisis they faced. A method not born from modern science but from ancient observation and centuries of woodland experience. A method called coppicing, a simple act of cutting a tree low to the ground and allowing it to return, not as a single trunk but as a crown of many shoots rising from the old stump, reborn faster and stronger, because the roots, vast and established beneath the soil, were still alive and waiting. It is astonishing to imagine that in a world where firewood was worth nearly as much as bread, medieval people already understood that a woodland could renew itself if treated with patience and discipline, because coppicing was not random cutting but a carefully timed cycle arranged by skilled foresters who divided woods into small sections, harvesting one section each year and leaving the others to regrow, so that by the time the workers returned to the starting point, sometimes after a rotation of 7, 12, or even 30 years, the trees had risen again, ready to provide another harvest of fuel without ever destroying the woodland itself. This system, quiet and unglamorous as it may seem, produced astonishing amounts of usable wood, far more than simply letting trees grow tall, because when a tree is cut low and encouraged to sprout many shoots, those shoots grow vigorously, reaching usable size far sooner than a single trunk would, and so a small coppiced forest could yield the same amount of wood as a large untouched one, offering a renewable source of heat, tools, fencing, and everyday materials that could support entire communities for centuries without ever exhausting the land. Records from medieval England describe forests carefully managed in this way, with surveys noting exactly how many acres could be cut each year, without causing waste or destruction, a phrase that reveals not only the method's effectiveness, but also how deeply it was understood, and modern tree ring analysis confirms that these practices were real, measurable, and widespread, with many ancient trees today still carrying the faint signatures of medieval coppice cycles hidden inside their rings like quiet whispers from another age. And yet, in the very places where this system could have saved thousands from freezing, it was largely withheld from the people who needed it most. because coppicing required one thing: peasants did not have access to woodland. Forests in medieval Europe were not communal spaces but tightly controlled territories, the property of lords, monasteries, and wealthy landowners who valued them for hunting rights, timber profits, and social power. And so, even though peasants knew the principles of coppicing and understood how to tend a woodland sustainably, they were forbidden from practicing it on any meaningful scale, because a coppiced tree was valuable, and value belonged to the privileged. For a peasant, the idea of managing a forest across decades was almost unthinkable, not because they lacked skill or foresight, but because they lacked permission, and every step into a forest carried the risk of fines, beatings, or worse, delivered by armed foresters whose loyalty was to the lord's interest, not to the survival of the families who lived under his rule. Thus, the most sustainable and abundant fuel source available in the medieval world, this quiet miracle of regrowth and renewal, remained locked behind social boundaries, its benefits captured by the very people who needed fire the least, while those who needed it the most continued to stare at their empty hearths, forced to search for anything that might burn long enough to carry them through the night. It is almost painful to imagine a peasant cottage on a winter evening, the cold seeping through every crack, the children huddled beneath blankets that never truly warmed, and outside, not far beyond the village boundary, a dense thicket of coppiced shoots rising from ancient stools, full of potential heat, full of life, full of the warmth that could have saved the entire household, but unreachable, because the law said the forest existed for the pleasure and the profit of the few, not for the survival of the many, and so denied the one resource that could have sustained them cleanly and endlessly. Peasants were pushed towards solutions that were far stranger, harder, dirtier, and sometimes heartbreaking, solutions that required them to burn things no one would ever willingly place into a hearth unless the alternative was death by cold, setting the stage for the strange, smoky, and surprisingly ingenious fuels we will explore next. Once the forest became forbidden places and firewood turned into a luxury too costly for ordinary families, medieval people looked not upward to the branches they could not touch but downward to the earth itself, discovering beneath their feet a strange, dark, spongy material that seemed at first glance more like soaked soil than fuel. Yet inside this dense, ancient substance lay enough trapped energy to warm entire villages through winters so bitter that water froze inside wooden buckets, and frost crept silently across the blankets of sleeping children. This unlikely saviour was peat. Peat formed slowly, patiently, over thousands of years in the bogs and wetlands of northern Europe, layer upon layer of plants falling, decaying, and compressing in the darkness, until the ground became a thick, water-soaked mass of half-formed minerals and organic life, something like the earliest stage of coal, not truly rock but not quite soil either, a transitional substance that burned not with bright flames but with a low, stubborn, smoke-filled glow that did not look impressive yet could outlast nearly any log. For communities living far from forests, especially in Ireland, Scotland, and the Netherlands, peat became not just an alternative, but the very heart of winter survival, though harvesting it was a labour so demanding that every member of a household, from the strongest men to the youngest children, had a role to play. The work began in spring, when the bogs softened under rising temperatures, and families ventured into fields where the ground trembled underfoot, marking out sections that would be drained by hand-dug channels, so the soggy surface could begin to firm. With the ground prepared, men used long, narrow, flat-bladed spades to carve the peat into bricks, lifting each dripping, heavy block from the earth in a practiced rhythmic motion, stacking them in long rows where the sun and wind could work on them. At this stage, the peat was little more than wet mud, nearly 90% water, so drying took weeks, even months, and required constant vigilance because a single summer storm could undo an entire season of work, turning the carefully cut blocks back into an unburnable mush. As the warm months passed, the bricks were turned, stacked, rearranged, and built into small pyramids or open towers that allowed the air to flow through. Families would often walk past their drying fields at dusk, checking the stacks with the same instinctive caution one might give to a growing crop, knowing that their survival in the coming winter depended on how well these bricks hardened before the cold returned. By autumn, the peat was transformed, lighter, tougher, crumbly at the edges, ready for the hearth, and its value went beyond anything money could buy, because a well-built peat stack outside a cottage was not merely a resource, but a promise, a quiet declaration to neighbours, and to the winter itself that this family would endure the months ahead. Yet peat did not burn like wood. It rarely produced high flames, choosing instead to glow in a slow, sullen smoulder, a kind of silent fire that stretched far into the night. This characteristic, inconvenient for cooking, became a perfect blessing for heating. A peat fire could be banked in the evening, gently covered with ash, and then coaxed back to life in the morning, with only a breath and a handful of kindling, meaning a household did not have to wake in the frozen dark to rebuild a fire from scratch. But peat came with a heavy price that medieval families had no choice but to accept the smoke, thick, acrid and earthy. Peat smoke drifted through poorly ventilated cottages until it coated rafters, darkened walls, and clung to clothing, filling the air with compounds that irritated eyes and lungs, causing coughs that never fully disappeared. Yet, when the choice was between breathing smoky air or feeling your blood chill in your veins as the night deepened, the decision was simple. Smoke was survivable, cold was not. The scale of peat burning in some regions was immense, far larger than one might imagine. In the Netherlands, during the Golden Age, peat consumption reached levels so high that nearly all the ancient bogs were mined into oblivion. Over centuries, thousands of hectares vanished, carved and hauled away brick by brick, until lakes formed where peat fields had once been, shaping not only the survival of families but the very geography of the land. It is almost soothing to picture a peat fire glowing in the corner of a medieval cottage, its soft heat radiating outward as a mother wraps her children in wool blankets, its dim light flickering against the walls as a father sits in silence, sharpening tools for the next day, the smell strong, the air smoky, yet all of it bound together by a gentle warmth that meant they had secured one more night of safety against the cold pressing at the door. And so, in a world where forests were guarded and winter seemed endless, families turned to the ancient earth, harvesting not branches or logs, but the slow memory of plants long dead, compacted into bricks that became the quiet, steady heartbeat of survival in lands too harsh and windswept for wood. For those medieval families who did not live near bogs, who could not harvest peat or whose land was too dry, too rocky, or too windswept for anything but the hardiest plants to grow, survival required turning their eyes toward the hillsides and moors, places where the forests had long since vanished and only stubborn shrubs clung to the earth, bending beneath winter storms yet refusing to die. These plants, gorse, heather, bracken, straw, and reeds, became the fuel of the truly poor, the fuel of people who lived on the margins of Europe, far from the sheltering woods, relying not on logs or peat but on whatever the wind allowed to survive. Gorse, often called furze, grew in tangled, thorn-covered thickets on open uplands, where trees could not root, its branches twisted and irregular, each one armed with sharp needles that made harvesting a painful chore. Yet for families in Ireland, Scotland, and Western England, gorse was sometimes the only source of winter heat, a stubborn, prickly plant that had adapted to the cold and the wind just as the people themselves had. To gather it, peasants wrapped their hands in cloth and pushed into the thickets, cutting branches and dragging them home, where the needles would be burned off first in a quick, crackling flame that filled the air with a distinctive, bitter scent. Once cleaned, the remaining wood, small, crooked, and hard to stack, burned surprisingly well, but only when someone stayed nearby to feed the fire constantly, because gorse did not smoulder like peat or coal, it demanded attention. Heather was gentler, soft and violet in summer, but in winter it dried into thin, brittle stems that could be bundled and used for quick bursts of heat. It burned fast, too fast for steady warmth. but it was invaluable for starting fires or for boosting a weak flame during the coldest nights. Travellers wrote of cottages where the hearth glowed purple and gold from the oils in the heather roots, the flames dancing for a moment before settling into embers that barely clung to life. And then came the most desperate of fuels: straw and reeds, materials never meant to heat a home but pressed into service because nothing else remained. Straw was abundant after harvest, so peasants gathered it in great quantities, drying it further under the weak autumn sun before twisting it into tight, rope-like bundles that burned hot and bright for only a few minutes. These bundles were precious, not because they lasted, but because they helped stretch the life of other fuels. A handful of straw could revive a dying peat ember, strengthen a small fire of gorse, or speed the boiling of water for porridge in the morning. A family might keep several baskets of straw near the hearth, each bundle carefully tied and ready, used sparingly because no one wanted to see the pile shrink too quickly, knowing that as winter deepened, even straw would be difficult to replace. On the coasts, reeds gathered from riverbanks and marshes were dried and used the same way, burning with a rush of heat that warmed hands and faces for a few hopeful moments before fading. What is remarkable in all these practices is not simply the resourcefulness, but the intimacy medieval people had with their landscape. Every hill, every plant, every season carried a different promise or warning, and villagers understood these patterns like a language passed down through generations. They knew which slopes grew the best heather, which patches of gorse produced the thickest stems, which valleys held reeds that dried quickly, and which days of autumn sun were strong enough to harden bundles for winter fires. Their lives reflect a delicate balance, using what the land offered without expecting more, adapting to its limitations, and accepting that warmth in winter was not a given, but the outcome of months of preparation. It is soothing, in a quiet and humbling way, to imagine a family in a coastal cottage, the wind rattling the shutters as the father feeds a twisting piece of gorse into the fire, the mother tying the last bundle of straw for the night, and the room glowing in uneven light as the children drift to sleep, wrapped in wool, knowing that tomorrow they will gather more plants from the hills because that is what survival requires. And so these simple fuels, shrubs, grasses, reeds, and stalks, became the humble guardians of countless winter nights, flickering and fleeting yet exactly enough to keep the cold at bay until morning, a fragile triumph woven from the resilience of the land and the quiet endurance of the people who lived upon it. Among all the unusual fuels medieval families learned to burn, none carried the emotional weight, the daily discomfort, or the cruel moral dilemma of animal dung, a fuel that came not from the forests or the hills or the bogs, but directly from the cattle and oxen that were themselves essential to survival, creatures valued for milk, meat, and strength, yet whose droppings, once dried, became one of the most dependable sources of winter heat, when every other resource had been exhausted or claimed by someone far above a peasant's station. To us, the idea is repulsive, but for medieval villagers living in harsh landscapes where trees had long since vanished and heather or gorse could not be gathered in enough quantity, dried dung was often the only thing left that could smoulder long enough to warm a cottage through the long nights of January, when winds roared across the fields and frost crept silently beneath the door. And what makes this practice both striking and deeply touching is the quiet routine that surrounded it. Women and children walking through fields at dawn, collecting fresh cowpats with simple wooden shovels, stacking them carefully in baskets, and carrying them back to the cottage as though they were gathering something precious. Once brought home, the wet dung was mixed with straw or chaff to give it structure, shaped into flat cakes with practiced hands, and then pressed against the exterior walls of a house or laid in neat rows on the ground to dry in the sun. Imagine an entire village in late autumn, cottages lined with brown circular patties clinging to their walls like strange decorations, each one curing slowly in the cool wind, each one destined to become a small but reliable ember in the family hearth. The sight would seem strange to us, even unsettling, but to them these drying cakes were symbols of safety, fuel stored not in wood piles but on the very skin of the home that depended on them. And once dry, these dung cakes burned with surprising effectiveness, producing steady, gentle heat that could last for hours, far longer than bundles of straw or heather could manage. Travelers from forested regions who passed through these treeless lands often wrote with astonishment about how warm the cottages felt, despite having no stacks of logs beside the door, the secret lying in the quiet glow of dung embers, smouldering under a low pot or behind a bank of ash. Yet behind this warmth, behind every ember, there was a terrible cost, one that defined the emotional reality of medieval life in ways often forgotten today. Because dung was not just fuel, it was also the core of fertility. It was the ingredient that kept soil alive, the essential nutrient returned to the earth each spring, so that crops could grow strong enough to feed a family. Every patty burned in winter was a patty not placed on the fields. Every handful of ash rising from the hearth was a handful of nutrients that would not be returned to the soil when planting time came. And because medieval farming balanced so precariously between abundance and famine, the choice to burn dung was never simply a matter of convenience. It was a decision taken with the quiet, heavy knowledge that warmth tonight might mean hunger months later. This impossible choice hung over many poor households. Do we burn the dung and stay warm now, or do we spread it on the fields and hope we survive long enough to enjoy the next harvest? Some families chose warmth, some chose soil, and most tried to find a fragile balance somewhere in between, burning just enough to survive the worst nights and saving what they could for spring. Archaeologists today still find the traces of these decisions. Tiny mineral remains called spherulites embedded in ancient hearths, microscopic fingerprints of burned dung that tell us this was not a rare practice, but a widespread, continuous tradition stretching back thousands of years, from early Neolithic farmers to medieval peasants who crouched beside small fires, watching the slow glow of dung embers as their children slept nearby. And so it is here, in the smouldering heart of a humble dung fire, that we see medieval resilience in one of its most fragile yet powerful forms. The willingness to endure discomfort, to accept unpleasantness, and to make painful decisions in the name of warmth, survival, and love. For in the quiet of a winter night, when snow pressed against the cottage walls and the wind moaned like something alive, the faint heat from a dung cake could mean the difference between a cold that hurt and a cold that killed, a warmth born from necessity, sacrifice, and the most ancient partnership between people, animals, and the land. Between the desperate fuels of the poorest peasants and the extravagant wood-fueled hearths of the nobility, existed a mysterious middle world, a world shaped not by chance, but by craftsmanship, patience, and a deep understanding of fire. It was the world of charcoal, a fuel so potent, so deceptively simple, and so essential to medieval technology that it quietly underpinned everything from cooking and heating to metalworking and warfare, all while being created through a process that felt almost like coaxing fire itself into a more disciplined, concentrated form. Charcoal was not found in the earth like peat, nor gathered from the fields like heather. It had to be made deliberately and carefully through a slow ritual that transformed ordinary wood into something far more powerful. To begin, medieval charcoal makers, known as colliers, selected straight, even billets of wood and stacked them in a precise conical shape around a central chimney-like shaft. Each piece placed with care because the structure had to stand firm yet breathe in the exact right way. Then, the entire mound was covered with turf, soil, and damp clay, sealing it into a dark, earthen dome that would soon glow from within like a sleeping beast. The magic began when the collier lit the fire at the base of the central shaft, allowing a thin thread of flame to creep upward, spreading sideways through the stacked wood, not with the roaring chaos of an open fire, but with a controlled, smouldering heat. The goal was not to let the wood burn completely, but to let it transform, to push out moisture, smoke, resin, and impurities, until only nearly pure carbon remained. Achieving this required a delicate balance of oxygen. Too little, and the fire would suffocate. Too much, and the entire mound would burst into uncontrolled flames, wasting days of labor in minutes. For days and nights the collier tended the kiln, adjusting vents, patching holes, watching the faint plumes of smoke that drifted from the mound like clues in a quiet riddle, reading them with the intuition of someone who had lived their entire life around wood and fire. The work was lonely and exhausting. Charcoal makers often slept beside their kilns, waking every hour to check the slope of the smoke or the settling of the mound, because a single mistake meant losing not just the wood but the effort of an entire crew. When the mound finally cooled and the earth covering was peeled away, the transformation revealed itself. The billets had turned black and brittle, far lighter than before, yet capable of burning twice as hot as wood with only a fraction of the smoke. In a world where heat meant survival and iron meant power, charcoal was nothing short of miraculous. Blacksmiths relied on it for the fierce temperatures needed to shape metal, villagers used it to bake bread and fire pottery, and wealthier households prized it for its clean burn and intense heat, a luxury compared to the smoky haze of peat and the acrid sting of dung. But its advantages went beyond comfort. Because charcoal weighed so much less than firewood while still holding enormous energy, it could be transported efficiently over long distances. A single cart of charcoal could warm far more homes than the same cart filled with logs, making it the lifeline of cities where wood was either too expensive or too distant to haul in large quantities. Yet for all its benefits, charcoal production consumed enormous amounts of raw wood, an irony at the heart of medieval energy. To create this refined, powerful fuel, entire sections of forest had to be harvested, cut, stacked, tended, and transformed, a process that demanded time, coordination, and access to woodland that most peasants simply did not possess. In many regions, colliers worked directly for lords or monasteries, producing charcoal not for the families who lived in the shadow of winter, but for blacksmiths, artisans, and the wealthy households that could afford it. Across Central Europe, archaeologists have discovered the remains of hundreds of ancient charcoal kilns, silent circles of blackened soil scattered across forests and hillsides, each one telling the story of a laborer who worked through summer nights and autumn rains to create the fuel that forged swords, hammered plowshares, shaped church bells, and warmed the hearths of people who rarely knew the hands that made it. For the poorest villagers, charcoal fires were rare luxuries, something purchased in tiny quantities on the coldest weeks of winter, or found only in the homes of craftspeople, whose livelihoods required intense heat. But even if they could not rely on charcoal as their primary fuel, its existence shaped the entire medieval world, raising temperatures high enough to smelt ore, build tools, and strengthen farms and armies alike. And so, in the quiet glow of a charcoal ember, hotter, cleaner, and more focused than peat or dung, we see a different kind of medieval survival, one built not from desperation, but from skill, patience, and a profound understanding of fire itself. It reminds us that even in an age defined by scarcity, there were people who mastered the art of coaxing energy from the simplest materials, turning wood into carbon and carbon into heat, one slow breath of smoke at a time. When every familiar fuel had been used, when the gorse bushes thinned, when the peat stacks grew small, and when even the precious dung cakes had become too few to spare, medieval families reached a point where survival demanded that nothing be wasted, where anything that could burn, anything at all, was gathered with quiet determination and carried to the hearth. And in these moments, at the very edge of scarcity, people turned to the final, unexpected sources of winter heat, bones and animal fat, substances that seemed too humble or too valuable to be used as fuel, yet became the thin line between endurance and cold when all other options had vanished. Bones, especially the large, dense bones of cattle, sheep, or pigs, might not look like firewood, but hidden inside them was a slow, steady caloric strength that could release heat over long hours when coaxed by a living ember. Archaeologists and fire researchers have shown that bones burn not with flames but with a deep, smouldering glow, fueled by marrow fats and proteins that linger long after the meat has been cut away. Medieval people did not need scientific experiments to understand this. They learned it through generations of winters, discovering that the remains of butchered animals once dried could be added to the hearth to keep a weak fire alive, stretching precious fuel in ways that sometimes meant the difference between frostbite and a peaceful night of rest. Imagine a winter evening inside a humble cottage, a father breaking marrow bones with a small axe, laying the pieces near the fire to dry further, their pale surfaces catching the faint amber light. Later, he slides a large leg bone into the embers, hearing the soft hiss as trapped moisture escapes, watching the surface darken and char, then smolder with a quiet, almost invisible glow. The smell, a mixture of burnt marrow and lingering fat, was sharp and unusual, yet it filled the room with warmth that drifted gently through the air, warming the faces of children who slept under rough wool blankets, unaware of the small sacrifice that kept the cold away. Fat, however, was even more precious, more symbolic of medieval survival, because in a world where calories meant life, animal fat was both food and fuel, both nourishment and fire. When possible, families saved every scrap, rendering beef tallow in large pots until it melted into a clear, shimmering liquid that could be stored in clay vessels for months. Most of this fat was reserved for cooking or eating, especially during the frigid days when bodies needed every ounce of energy to fight the cold. Yet in times of desperation, when the peat stack was gone, when no branches or straw remained, even this valuable substance became part of the hearth. The method was simple but effective. A small cloth, rush, or piece of braided plant fiber was soaked in melted tallow and then placed into a shallow metal or clay dish. When lit, the wick drew the fat upward, producing a steady, gentle flame that flickered with a yellow warmth far brighter than a peat ember and far cleaner than a dung cake. It did not heat an entire cottage, but it offered pockets of comfort, the warm circle of light where a mother mended clothes, the soft glow beside a child trying to fall asleep, the steady flame that kept frost from forming on a water jug overnight. This kind of heat was deeply personal, because every moment it burned was a moment of sacrifice. The fat used for warmth was fat not eaten, and in the dreadful hunger months of February and March, the starving time that choice could echo through the weeks ahead, yet families made this decision quietly, again and again, because in the depth of night, when the cold pressed hardest, the immediate warmth of a tallow flame could feel like mercy itself. It is humbling to picture a medieval household on such a night, the wind clawing at the shutters while a small tallow flame burns steadily on a wooden table, casting long, soft shadows across the room. A single bone glows faintly beneath the ashes of the hearth, giving off just enough heat to keep frost from forming on the inside walls. A child shifts in sleep, touching the edge of the blanket warmed by the thin radiance of these last resort fuels, unaware of the calculations and sacrifices that brought that warmth into being. Bones and fat may seem like humble, even grim resources, yet they reveal the deep resilience and ingenuity of people who refused to let winter claim their families, who found ways to turn every remaining scrap of life, even the leftovers of a butchered animal, into a shield against the cold. In these quiet acts of transformation, warmth became something earned with effort and sacrifice, a fragile but fiercely protected treasure that carried them from one day to the next through the dark, breath-stealing nights of the medieval winter. When the forests had thinned to guarded remnants, when peat bogs lay far from the growing cities, and when charcoal had become too precious for ordinary families to buy in large quantity, medieval people, especially those living in crowded, expanding urban centers, began to look toward a fuel that seemed at first like a curiosity, a strange black rock that washed ashore on northern beaches, heavy and cold to the touch, its dark surface glistening with a hint of oil. This rock, known at first as sea coal, would transform winter heating forever, not because it was pleasant or clean, far from it, but because it offered an energy so dense and so accessible that even the poorest laborers, desperate to warm their cramped homes, would eventually embrace its choking smoke for the simple promise of warmth. Coal had been known to the ancient Romans, who used it in small amounts along the northern edge of their empire, but after their departure the knowledge faded, and for centuries people treated coal as little more than a strange curiosity that occasionally washed up after storms. Yet as medieval cities grew larger, and as the demand for firewood drove prices beyond what ordinary people could afford, those who lived near coal-rich lands began to realize that the black stones they had ignored for generations could burn with surprising intensity, producing a heat that lasted far longer than wood, and at a fraction of the transport cost. It was not the rural poor who first embraced coal. They had peat and brush and animal dung, but rather city dwellers, men and women living in tightly packed houses, where wood was scarce and the nearest forest lay days away. For them, coal became the quiet answer to a growing crisis, a lifeline shipped down from northern mines on small boats and barges, unloaded onto docks in sooty heaps, and carried through the streets in baskets to homes whose chimneys were barely prepared for such a brutal fuel. And brutal it was, for coal smoke was something entirely different from the gentle haze of peat or the earthy sting of burning dung. Coal produced plumes of thick yellow-grey fumes that clung to the air with an almost oily persistence, filling rooms with a sulphurous tang that burned the throat and blackened every surface it touched. Medieval chimneys, designed for wood fires that sent smoke drifting upward in thin ribbons, struggled under this new load, forcing coal smoke to spill backward into homes until rafters, pots, blankets, and even the hair and clothing of the inhabitants took on a permanent smoky scent. Yet despite its unpleasantness, coal had an undeniable advantage. It was cheap, it burned fiercely, and it lasted. A small pile of coal could keep a fire alive long after wood embers had died, offering warmth to families who had no other choice. In the harshest winters, when the Thames froze and the cold moved through London like a silent predator, even the wealthy began to rely on coal fires, despite their complaints about the stench, because the alternative was simply too dangerous. The growing use of coal created something Europe had never seen before, an urban air pollution crisis, a city-sized haze that drifted through medieval London like an unnatural fog. Chroniclers wrote of skies darkened at midday, of a permanent sour smell in the air, of city dwellers coughing through the winter months with lungs irritated, not by disease but by the relentless smoke of this new fuel. The problem grew so severe that in 1272 King Edward I issued a proclamation banning the burning of sea coal in London, declaring that anyone who continued to use it would face punishment. But such laws, however stern, could not compete with economic reality. Wood was too expensive, forests too distant, and coal too effective to abandon. And so, despite royal commands, Londoners kept burning coal, filling the city with a haze that settled between rooftops and drifted across the river like a low, smoky tide. By the early 1600s, 3/4 of the city's fuel consumption came from coal, marking the beginning of a transition that would eventually reshape not just winter heating but the entire trajectory of human civilization. For the medieval poor, though, coal was never a symbol of industry or progress. It was simply one more difficult tool for survival, a rock that burned with a ferocity they both needed and feared. Picture a small London house in winter, a mother leaning over a shallow brazier, coaxing a chunk of sea coal into smouldering life, her eyes watering from the sting of sulphur, her children pulling blankets closer as the room fills with the unmistakable scent of burning stone. Outside, chimneys spew dark smoke into the low sky, and the streets echo with the coughs of pedestrians hurrying home before dusk. In this world, warmth came not from comfort but from compromise, a quiet trade between breath and heat that families accepted because the cold could kill far faster than the smoke. And in that dim, smoky glow, the story of medieval winter survival reaches its final somber chapter, a chapter where innovation, necessity and hardship collided in the hearths of thousands of homes, replacing the sweet scent of wood with the acrid fumes of a rock dug from the earth. And so, when we step back from this long, winding journey through the fuels of the medieval winter, the forbidden firewood guarded by lords and laws, the slow-burning peat carved from ancient bogs, the stubborn gorse and heather gathered from wind-scoured hills, the desperate cakes of dried dung pressed onto cottage walls, the carefully crafted charcoal tended by lonely colliers, the smouldering bones and flickering tallow flames, and finally the foul black coal that cloaked entire cities in smoke. A single truth begins to emerge, quiet and heavy, like the soft drift of ash settling after a long night's fire. Medieval people survived not because their world was easy, but because they were endlessly, relentlessly inventive in the face of scarcity. It is soothing, in a strange way, to imagine that every ember burning in every hearth, whether bright or dim, clean or choking, came from a decision shaped by love and fear and perseverance. A mother choosing dung over frost because her children were shivering, a father trudging through a bog to lift waterlogged peat, knowing it would save his family in January, a collier tending his kiln through the night, because the warmth of an entire village depended on the carbon he coaxed from wood, a child gathering heather with numb fingers, because even a few minutes of flame made a difference. Their world was one where every crack in a wall let in a thread of cold, where windows were oiled parchment rather than glass, where the wind seemed to pierce through clothing no matter how many layers were worn, and where warmth was not a background comfort but a daily achievement, fragile and never fully secure. In those long winters, the fire at the center of the home became almost sacred, a thin shield against the darkness, glowing not with abundance, but with the sheer will to endure. And yet, perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not the desperation or the ingenuity, but the realization that medieval society could have prevented much of this suffering. They had the knowledge, the elegant cycles of coppicing, the deep understanding of woodland renewal, the disciplined forestry techniques that modern ecologists continue to admire. The problem was not science, nor skill, nor understanding. The problem was access. The forests, the one resource capable of sustaining entire populations safely and sustainably, were locked behind social walls, guarded by rules designed to protect the comfort of the few, instead of the survival of the many. So families turned to whatever the land allowed them to touch, and in doing so they built a world of strange, smoky, surprising fuels, each one carrying within it a small act of defiance against the winter that surrounded them. When peat smouldered through the night, it whispered that the people living near the bogs had refused to surrender to treeless hills. When dung burned gently beneath a pot, it carried the quiet bravery of a family choosing warmth over pride. When coal blackened the sky above London, it revealed how resource scarcity could reshape even the greatest cities. The medieval winter, then, was not simply a season, it was a test of endurance, of creativity, of sacrifice, and of the fragile systems that determined who had firewood and who had smoke. The hearth was a battlefield, and every fuel, humble or foul, precious or strange, was a victory won against the cold. And now, as we imagine these cottages with their dim fires, their crackling peat, their small glowing embers of bone or dung or fat, we can feel a kind of gentle connection stretching across the centuries, a reminder that warmth at its core has always been something earned, something protected, something carried forward through ingenuity and stubborn hope. The smoke of those medieval fires has long since faded into the sky of forgotten winters, but the lessons remain, drifting quietly through history, like a soft haze at dawn, that survival is often built from whatever we have, that knowledge means little without fairness, and that the line between warmth and cold has always depended on how well people share the resources that sustain life. It is a story not just about the past, but about the fragile balance that still shapes our world, and as we settle into the calm of night, imagining the glow of those ancient fires, their warmth lingers in our thoughts like a final ember that refuses to die. Even after we understand the strange fuels medieval people burned, and the smoky glow that filled their cottages on freezing nights, there is still another layer to this winter world, a softer and more intimate layer that reveals how deeply fire shaped the rhythm of their lives. Because in a time when cold dictated everything, how people slept, worked, cooked, and even prayed, the hearth became not just a place of heat, but the quiet center around which every evening unfolded. When darkness fell early, long before most of us would consider ending our day, families gathered close to the fire, not simply for warmth but for companionship, forming a small circle of light against the vast, breath-stealing cold outside. The fire, whether fueled by peat, dung, heather, or bone, cast a dim and unsteady glow across the room, illuminating rough wooden beams and the soft outlines of woven baskets, clay pots, and woolen blankets, draped over sleeping children. The smell of smoke clung to everything: clothing, hair, bedding, so familiar to them that it faded into the background of daily life, a scent that meant survival rather than discomfort. In these slow winter evenings, stories became the quiet heartbeat of the home. The older members of the family would speak in soft voices about years when the frost came early, or about winters when the peat stack nearly ran out, or about lessons learned when a neighbor's roof collapsed under heavy snow. Children listened with a mixture of fear and awe, learning through these whispered tales what the land demanded and how people had survived before them, absorbing a kind of wisdom that came not from books but from the warmth of shared experience. Work, too, moved toward the fire. Clothes were mended by hand in the flickering light. Tools were sharpened slowly and patiently. Baskets were woven with practiced motions that required little sight, relying more on memory and touch. Even meals took on a different rhythm. Thick porridges warmed in small pots nestled directly into the embers, simple breads baked beside a peat glow, stews left to simmer in the gentlest heat a dung fire could give. Nothing was rushed, nothing could be. Winter demanded patience. Sometimes in the deep hours of the night, someone would rise quietly to check the fire, adding a handful of smouldering peat or shifting the ashes to keep a tiny ember alive until morning. These small movements, barely audible, were acts of protection, gestures made not out of fear but out of love, ensuring that the cold never fully claimed the house. Outside, the wind roared and the snow thickened, covering the world in silence. But inside, near the hearth, time seemed to slow into a soft and steady rhythm. The crackle of a dry twig, the low hum of a smouldering peat brick, the occasional sigh of someone half asleep under heavy blankets. And in that space, lit only by the faint orange glow of whatever strange fuel was burning, medieval winter revealed itself not only as a season of hardship, but also as a season of closeness, reflection, and quiet routine, where the smallest fire became a gathering place, and where warmth, however it was made, shaped the very meaning of home. Before the first hint of light touched the horizon, long before the sky softened from black to the faintest blue, medieval winter mornings began not with movement, but with a stillness so complete that even breath felt suspended in the cold air, and in this quiet, the house held its own fragile world, one where warmth had faded into memory during the night, and only the thinnest threads of heat lingered beneath the ash of a dying fire. The first to wake was often the mother or the oldest child, rising not because the hour was comfortable but because the fire demanded attention. The cold inside a medieval cottage before dawn was a cold that defies modern imagination. Air so sharp it bit at fingers, floors so frigid they numbed bare feet. The moment they touched the ground, and breath that shimmered faintly, like pale smoke, in the still air above the bed. Blankets stiffened at the edges, wool cloaks clung heavily to sleeping bodies, and every movement felt slower, heavier, shaped by the need to preserve warmth. Rekindling the fire was a ritual as old as the home itself. With slow, silent steps, the early riser knelt at the hearth and gently brushed aside the grey layer of ash, searching for a single ember, a tiny glowing coal no larger than a grain of wheat, fragile yet alive. Many medieval families banked their fires carefully at night for this reason, pushing smouldering peat or dung deep into ash so that a spark would survive until morning, because starting a fire from nothing was not only difficult but dangerous on a morning when frost pressed like glass against the cottage walls. Once the ember was found, the real work began. A handful of dry straw or shaved wood was placed beside it, cupped like something precious, and the ember was coaxed toward life with careful breaths, each exhale warm and gentle, as though waking a sleeping creature. The straw caught slowly, then quickly crackling into light, and the fire grew from a glow to a flicker, from a flicker to a small flame that cast trembling shadows on the walls. Only then did the icy air inside the cottage begin to shift from biting to bearable. Around this small fire the family stirred. Children emerged from blankets cautiously, clutching wool wraps around their shoulders, moving closer to the warmth with sleepy steps. The father stretched stiff limbs made heavy by the cold, inspecting tools left beside the fire the night before. The animals, if the family kept them indoors during winter nights, rustled softly in the darkness, a cow shifting on its straw bedding, a chicken lifting its head, the quiet warmth of animals mingling with the warmth of the waking flame. Outside, dawn crept slowly, almost reluctantly. Frost coated every surface, transforming the cottage roof into a pale, glistening shell. The world beyond the door was silent, except for the far-off crack of ice as tree branches bent under the weight of winter. Smoke from neighboring cottages rose straight upward, unbothered by wind, forming thin grey pillars against the still dark sky, each one a signal that another family too had found their ember and coaxed it back to life. Inside, as the fire strengthened, the day gradually took shape. A pot was placed over the growing flame, its metal cold, its contents simple, oats, maybe, or yesterday's stew stretched with water, but warm enough to steam faintly after a few minutes. Clothes, still chilled from the night, were laid near the hearth to soften. Hands were rubbed together, breaths deepened, the stiffness of sleep slowly faded, and the house, once frozen and silent, began to breathe again. And so, every winter morning in medieval Europe began with this quiet negotiation between cold and flame, a fragile transition from darkness to life, from the impossibility of surviving the night to the steady rhythm of a new day. The ember saved at dusk became the spark of morning, connecting one day of endurance to the next, in a chain that stretched through months of relentless cold, a chain that families protected with care, love, and patience. The cold outside might have been immense, vast enough to swallow entire landscapes in silence, but inside the cottage the fire, small, smoky, flickering, held the power to shape every hour that followed, guiding the household from waking to work, from frost to comfort, from survival to the simple, fragile warmth of living. If the medieval fire was the heart of winter survival, then clothing was its outer shell, a second cocoon that wrapped the body against the relentless cold, and each piece, from the roughest wool tunic to the smallest stitched hood, carried not only warmth, but the quiet wisdom of generations who had learned to endure nights when frost crawled across the inside of windows, and the air inside a cottage lay so cold that metal tools stung to the touch. Dressing for such winters was not a matter of style or convenience. It was a ritual of necessity, carried out slowly each morning with careful hands and a lingering awareness that warmth once gained should never be wasted. The foundation of winter clothing was always wool. Thick, coarse, heavy wool, spun from the sheep that grazed the summer fields, and woven into garments that trapped warm air close to the skin. Underclothes were often simple linen shirts that softened with age, worn year after year, until the fabric thinned and frayed. But over these went layers of woolen tunics, cloaks, and hose, each one slightly rough, slightly scratchy, but capable of holding heat, even when the air around them felt like sharpened ice. A well-made wool cloak, pinned at the shoulder, or tied with a leather cord, was as valuable as any tool in the house, and people often slept with them pulled tightly around their bodies, using them as both blankets and protection against the drafts that slipped through timber walls. Hoods were another essential, long and pointed in some regions, lined with fur in others, drawn up in the mornings to preserve warmth before the fire had grown strong. Mittens and gloves were harder to come by. Many peasants had none at all, so sleeves were crafted to extend past the wrist. allowing hands to disappear inside the fabric when frost threatened to numb the fingers. Feet were wrapped in strips of cloth, sometimes layered with wool or stuffed with straw for insulation, then slipped into heavy boots that were often stiff with cold when first put on. Even indoors, these makeshift wrappings stayed on, because the floors, made of stone or packed earth, absorbed cold like a sponge and returned it through bare soles with startling speed. But warmth did not come from clothing alone. The medieval bed was itself a fortress against winter's reach, constructed with straw or feathers packed into coarse linen sacks that rustled softly when someone shifted in their sleep. Blankets, layered one upon another, ranged from simple woolen weaves to heavy mantles that had once been cloaks, repurposed when they became too worn for daily wear. Families slept close, often very close, not out of sentimental attachment, though affection certainly played its part, but because body heat shared between parents, children, and sometimes even farm animals was the simplest and most reliable insulation they possessed. In the deepest cold, it was common for families to tuck heated stones wrapped in cloth into their beds before lying down, letting the trapped warmth chase away the first sting of the frosty night. In cottages where the fire burned low, people sometimes lay with their feet directed toward the hearth, hoping the embers' faint radiance would travel far enough to soften the cold around their blankets. The smallest children were placed in the warmest spaces between older siblings or beside their mother, where the layered heat held through the long hours until dawn. Even the animals played a role in this shared warmth. In many households, a cow or a pair of goats slept in a small corner of the main room, not only because it protected them from freezing winds, but because their body heat softened the air, raising the temperature of the room by a degree or two, a difference that could be felt and cherished by everyone inside. Layer by layer, blanket by blanket, touch by touch, warmth was created as a communal act, a quiet collaboration between people, animals, clothing, and the humble fire still smouldering at the center of the home. Each night, as the wind scraped across the shutters and the moon cast pale light over the frozen fields, families settled under their layered coverings, drawing close in small, steady breaths, feeling the slow comfort of shared heat gather beneath the blankets, like a living presence. And in this closeness, winter revealed another truth, that survival was not only a matter of fuel or fire, but of companionship, of bodies gathered together against the cold, of soft murmurs before sleep, of hands intertwined in the dark, and of the warmth that flows naturally from human closeness, turning even the smallest, coldest room into a sanctuary of shared endurance. Even though the inside of a medieval cottage became a fragile refuge against the cold, life could not unfold entirely beside the hearth, and the late mornings and short afternoons of winter eventually called people outside, into a world where the air was sharp enough to sting the throat, where each step through the deep, uneven snow required effort and patience, and where work, no matter how difficult, still had to be done, because the animals needed feeding, the tools needed mending, and the village depended on the slow, steady rhythm of daily labor, even when it felt as if the entire landscape had fallen into a silent, frozen sleep. Stepping outside, a man would always feel the same shock, a sudden, instinctive tightening of the chest, as the cold infiltrated through every layer of wool, creeping beneath cloaks and sleeves, searching for the smallest gaps where warmth could escape, forcing him to pull his cloak tighter across his shoulders and raise his hood to shield his cheeks from the merciless edge of the wind. His breath rose before him in a pale white cloud, swirling in the still morning air, each exhale hanging for a moment as though time itself had slowed to match the cold. The walk to the barn was always the first challenge of the day. Snow, trampled in places where people had passed before, was still treacherous, and in untouched areas it rose nearly to the knee, clinging to boots and weighing down each careful step. The frozen ground groaned faintly underfoot, and the distant edge of the woodland, familiar and close in warmer seasons, seemed strange and distant in winter's quiet, wrapped in mist and heavy frost. When the barn door was opened, a soft wave of warmer, animal-scented air met him, filled with the gentle sounds of creatures shifting in the straw. The cow let out a slow, muffled breath as if relieved to see someone bringing hay. The sheep rustled in their enclosure, their thick winter coats catching small flecks of frost that drifted in from the cold. Even the chickens, tucked together for warmth, stirred drowsily, blinking at the faint light filtering through the wooden slats. The animals depended entirely on human hands, and their breath warmed the air in the dim barn more effectively than any fire could. Feeding them required more than simply scattering hay or grain. It meant breaking ice from water troughs with a mallet, gathering armfuls of straw from lofts where the cold bit at the fingers, and moving slowly, deliberately, because every action in the cold required twice the strength. The man would sometimes pause, leaning against a wooden beam, listening to the quiet chewing of the animals as steam drifted gently from their bodies, rising toward the roof in lazy spirals that softened the harshness of the morning. Beyond the barn, fields lay silent under a thick coat of frost, their boundaries marked only by hedgerows glittering with ice. Fences had to be checked for winter damage, gates had to be lifted when frozen hinges refused to move, and firewood, if any was permitted to be gathered at all, needed to be hauled in small bundles from the edges of the Lord's land, each trip made cautiously to avoid drawing the attention of foresters who patrolled the borders, even in bitter weather. The village itself moved quietly in winter. People walked with heads lowered, conserving heat. Dogs padded through the snow in narrow paths between cottages. Thin plumes of smoke rose from every chimney, straight and unwavering in the windless air. The soundscape was soft. The crunch of snow, the groan of frozen wood, the distant bleating of sheep, the occasional call of a neighbor muffled by layers of wool. By midday, the weak winter sun hovered low in the sky, casting a pale light across the fields that offered little warmth but enough brightness to remind people that the day still moved forward. Work continued with quiet persistence, repairing harnesses beside the barn, mending nets for spring, chopping what little scrap wood could be found, or clearing paths so the next morning would be gentler. And all of it, every step through the snow, every task that stiffened the fingers, every breath taken through wool-wrapped faces, was done with the steady knowledge that as the afternoon faded, the precious hours of daylight would slip away once more, and the cottage, with its small hearth and smoky glow, would again become the center of life, the one place where warmth gathered like a fragile promise against the cold. If daily labor around the home was already a quiet struggle against the cold, then traveling in winter, even for the shortest distance between villages, became a slow and uncertain journey through a landscape transformed by frost, a world where familiar roads disappeared beneath drifting snow, where forest paths narrowed into shadowed corridors of ice, and where every step forward required a careful balance between necessity and caution. Medieval winter travel was not something taken lightly. It was an act of endurance shaped by quiet fear, deep patience, and an intimate awareness of nature's unpredictable moods. A traveller stepping out onto the winter road felt an immediate difference in the world. The air carried a deeper stillness, an almost eerie quiet that wrapped itself around the countryside like a blanket, muffling sounds so thoroughly that even one's own footsteps seemed distant. Snow covered the fields in a smooth, unbroken sheet, softening the edges of hedgerows and burying the low stone walls that marked property lines. The familiar signs of life, cart ruts, footprints, grazing marks, vanished beneath the white surface, leaving only a vast, undisturbed expanse that made distances feel longer and the world feel larger. Paths that had been trodden by countless feet in warmer seasons became narrow tracks carved by the few who dared to venture out. Ice gathered beneath the snow, turning each step into a quiet negotiation, and the simplest incline could become a struggle if the wind had polished the surface into a slick, glass-like sheen. Travellers often used long sticks to probe the ground ahead, searching for hidden patches of ice, deep pockets of drifted snow, or small streams now concealed under a fragile crust of frost. Horses moved cautiously in winter, their breath rising in great white clouds as they tested the ground with deliberate steps. Hooves that clattered confidently on dry earth fell silent on snow, leaving soft, round prints that vanished quickly beneath new flakes. Carts creaked painfully under the strain of frozen axles, and the cold made metal snap and wood contract, so journeys were slow, halting, and accompanied by the constant need to stop and adjust some part of the equipment strained by the weather. But perhaps the deepest challenge of winter travel was the forest. In warmer months, the woods were full of life and sound, but in winter they became something entirely different. Towering arches of bare branches dusted with snow, shadows stretched long across frozen soil, the air so still that even a single falling twig echoed like a distant whisper. The narrow paths beneath these trees became tunnels of cold where the sun rarely touched, and the temperature dropped with every step deeper into the forest's quiet. Travelers walked with hoods drawn low and eyes alert, not only because wolves were known to roam in winter, thin, desperate, and emboldened by hunger, but because the cold itself seemed alive in the forest, settling in pockets of still air that felt colder than anywhere else. A sudden wind could send snow cascading from the branches like a soft white shower, and the tiniest sound, the crack of a frozen stick, the distant call of a bird, felt sharp against the silence. Even between villages, danger often came from the simplest things: a bridge hidden beneath ice, a riverbank that looked solid but shifted under pressure, a hollow where the snow lay deeper than expected. Travelers moved in small groups whenever possible, their voices low, their pace steady, their focus fixed on the path ahead. They carried torches when night approached early, their warm orange glow flickering against the encroaching blue of winter dusk, lighting their way through shadows that stretched along the ground like long, sleeping creatures. Yet, for all its dangers, winter travel also carried moments of unexpected beauty. The sun, low in the sky, cast a silver light across frozen ponds. Ice crystals clung to branches in delicate patterns that glittered like glass, and the distant shapes of cottages, their chimneys sending thin threads of smoke into the still air, appeared like gentle invitations promising warmth and shelter. In the deepest cold, even the smallest glimmer of light, a lantern in a distant window, a fire flickering behind shutters, became a beacon of comfort and hope. And so, step by step, hour by hour, medieval travelers made their way through the frozen world, guided by instinct, endurance, and the quiet determination that carried them from one village to the next, knowing that beyond the snow-covered fields lay the familiar glow of a hearth, the soft murmur of voices, and the promise of rest after a day spent walking through winter's vast, silent embrace. Even in the harshest winters, when frost pressed against cottage walls, and the nights stretched so long that they seemed to swallow the world whole, medieval life did not unfold entirely in silence or solitude. There were moments, rare, tender, deeply human, when villagers came together despite the cold, gathering in the warmest home of the settlement, or in the dim interior of a communal hall, bringing with them small offerings of food, bits of warmth, and stories meant to soften the weight of the season. These winter gatherings, simple and unadorned as they were, became anchors of comfort in a landscape ruled by snow and darkness. As evening fell, people stepped cautiously along narrow paths carved through the drifts, cloaks pulled around their shoulders, boots sinking softly into the snow, the cold nipping at their cheeks while tiny lanterns flickered in their hands. The village, usually quiet at that hour, stirred with a gentle hum, the muted sound of neighbors calling softly to one another, the creak of gate hinges brushed with frost, the distant bark of a dog eager for company in the lonely winter night. Inside the gathering place, whether it was the largest cottage or the old timbered hall at the center of the settlement, warmth pooled thickly in the air. A fire fed with precious fuel collected bit by bit, glowed in the hearth, not roaring, not strong, but steady enough to fill the room with a gentle amber light that softened every face and cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. People settled on benches or low stools, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, shaking the snow from their cloaks, their breaths mingling with the warmth, as they found places beside friends they had known all their lives. Food at these gatherings was never extravagant. It came in humble wooden bowls and small cloth bundles, thick winter stews simmered for hours over a peat flame, coarse loaves of bread baked earlier in the day, hard cheese preserved from the summer, roasted roots dug from frozen cellars, and occasionally, on a night of celebration, a small piece of dried fruit or a bit of meat saved for special moments. People shared what they had, passing bowls from hand to hand, knowing that in winter, generosity was not an act of abundance but a declaration of solidarity. Children, wrapped tightly in cloaks, clustered near the fire, watching sparks drift upward like tiny stars before fading into the shadows above. Their cheeks glowed in the warmth, and the adults let their laughter soften for them, telling gentle stories rather than frightening ones, though older tales, stories of ghosts, winter spirits, and creatures that wandered the snow, often slipped into the conversation as the night stretched on. Voices rose and fell in slow waves. Someone recounted a memory of a winter so cold that the river froze to the bottom. Another spoke about the year a traveller arrived on Christmas Eve, half-starved but carrying a song none of them had heard before. A grandmother described how people used to burn bundles of herbs on the longest night to chase away the dark, and a father told his children how their great-grandparents survived a blizzard by sleeping in shifts beside a single ember buried beneath ash. These stories flowed not because anyone expected entertainment, but because in the deep of winter, words were a kind of warmth, soft, human, and shared. The fire might have been small, the food sparse, but the room felt alive with a gentle warmth that rose from the crowd itself. Dozens of breaths, dozens of quiet heartbeats, dozens of bodies drawing close to protect one another from the cold outside. And when the time came to leave, when the fire began to sink into a soft red glow, and even the bravest children rubbed their eyes with sleep, the villagers stepped once again into the frozen night, lanterns in hand, their footsteps weaving faint trails back toward their homes. The air felt colder then, as if reminding them of the world they lived in, but something inside them carried new warmth. The memory of faces lit by firelight, of shared food, of stories passed gently from one generation to the next. These gatherings did not make winter shorter, nor did they make the cold less bitter, but they reminded every person in the village that survival was not a solitary task. It was a shared burden, carried together through dark nights, warm fires, and small moments of human closeness that glowed brighter than any peat ember, brighter even than the longest chain of winter stars. In a world where winter shaped every hour of the day and every breath taken in the icy air, medieval people did not see the cold months merely as a season of hardship, but as a time woven through with meanings, signs, and silent forces that felt closest to the human world when the nights grew longest. Superstitions, customs, and soft-spoken rituals seeped into the fabric of winter life, offering not only comfort but a quiet sense that the world, even in its harshest form, was full of unseen patterns that guided each household through the darkest weeks of the year. As the solstice approached, those deep December nights when the sun seemed to barely rise at all, villagers watched the sky with a mix of awe and apprehension, believing that on the longest night, the boundary between the human world and the unseen one grew thin. Fires were tended carefully on that evening, not for heat alone, but to keep away wandering spirits that people imagined drifting across the frozen fields like pale shadows searching for warmth. Some families placed small embers near windows and door thresholds, believing the glow would guide good spirits inside while deterring the darker ones. Evergreens brought into the cottage were not decorations but symbols, ancient reminders that life did not die even when the fields lay asleep beneath snow. A sprig of holly placed above the hearth was said to protect the home from misfortune. Ivy hung over the door represented the quiet persistence of growth in a world that seemed frozen still. Even a bundle of herbs, tied with twine and hung from a rafter, was believed to guard the household, its scent, sweet or earthy, mixing with the smoke drifting from the hearth. Winter was also a time of omens. A sudden crack in the ice outside the cottage might be interpreted as a sign of coming change. A frost pattern on the window, delicate as lace, could be read like a message about the days ahead. The behavior of animals was watched closely. A dog pacing at night was believed to sense a shift in weather. An owl calling near the village could frighten children into clutching their blankets tightly, as elders whispered about old stories of winter spirits moving through the trees. But not all beliefs were born of fear. Some held reassurance. On the solstice night, families often left a small piece of bread outside the door, a gesture of offering to whatever wandered through the darkness, not in fear but in courtesy, acknowledging that winter was too powerful a presence to ignore. It was a silent agreement. We give something, and in return may the cold pass gently by our home. In the days following the solstice, when the sunlight began to grow by mere seconds each morning, people lit candles not only to brighten their cottages, but to mark the slow return of warmth. Children watched those candles with fascination, as if the growing flame captured the strength of the sun itself. Elders spoke softly of how every year the light returned, slowly, quietly, faithfully, and that even in the harshest winters, the world always found its way back to spring. Nighttime especially held a quiet spirituality. When everyone had retreated indoors and the final embers in the hearth were pushed deep to survive until morning, families sometimes whispered short blessings, simple words for protection, over the animals, over the fields resting under snow, over neighbors sleeping nearby. These were not formal prayers but soft hopes, woven from the belief that survival depended as much on community and intention as on fuel and food. There were also winter tales, passed from one generation to the next, of creatures that lived only in snowstorms, of lights that flickered across frozen rivers, of sudden gusts of wind that carried messages from long-departed ancestors. Children listened with wide eyes, wrapped in blankets beside the fire, while adults smiled knowingly, understanding that such stories were not meant to frighten but to fill long nights with a sense of wonder, a reminder that even in the coldest darkness, the world was alive with mystery. And when the night was at its deepest, when frost glittered on the window like a silent constellation, the fire glowed gently in the hearth, and the entire household lay tucked beneath blankets. Medieval winter revealed a truth that went beyond survival, that warmth was not only something made by fire, but something created through shared belief, through rituals that brought comfort, and through the quiet assurance that even the longest winter night carried the promise of returning light. If warmth was the first challenge of winter, food was the second, and in many ways the more delicate one, because while fire could be coaxed from peat or dung or bone, nourishment depended entirely on the careful planning of the previous seasons, on the strength of the harvest, and on the quiet wisdom of storing every possible scrap before the fields froze and the orchards fell silent. In medieval winter, food was not simply eaten, it was guarded, rationed, preserved, and handled with a kind of reverence that came from knowing that each meal brought a family one step closer to spring. Inside a medieval cottage, food lived mostly in shadows. Clay jars lined the walls filled with grains, oats, barley, and sometimes rye, the grains that could survive months of storage without spoiling. Baskets held dried beans and peas waiting to be softened in a pot hung low over the hearth. Root vegetables dug from the earth in late autumn lay packed in cool corners under straw. Onions braided together in long strings, turnips and parsnips resting quietly in wooden bins, carrots stored in layers of sand to keep them firm beneath winter's chill. Salted meat. When a family had been fortunate enough to slaughter a pig or a goat before winter began, hung from rafters or rested in barrels, its strong scent softened only by weeks and months of curing. A slab of salted pork might be precious enough to last through the season, carved bit by bit into stews so thin and slow that the meat itself almost dissolved, leaving behind only its flavor, a small reminder of fat and salt in a world dominated by cold simplicity. Preservation was a craft practiced with devotion. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar, herbs were dried in bundles that hung from beams, fruits were transformed into thick pastes pressed between layers of cloth, and dairy, when available, was coaxed into cheeses hard enough to survive the cold months without spoiling. These preserved foods were not luxuries. They were anchors of survival, links between the warmth of autumn and the hunger of late winter. Cooking in these months was an act of patience. A pot would be placed over the fire at dawn, filled with whatever could be spared, a handful of barley, a single onion, maybe the small end of a salted bone, and the stew would simmer slowly for hours, absorbing the gentle heat from the peat or dung embers beneath it. The smell, faint but comforting, drifted through the cottage all day, mingling with the smell of wool, smoke, and cold air that seeped in through the cracks. Meals were simple, repetitive, and reassuring, their warmth offering comfort more than abundance. Bread, when it could be made, tasted different in winter. The dough rose slowly in the cold, often needing to be placed near the fire to warm enough for the yeast to breathe. Flour was precious, ground from summer grains stored carefully in sacks, and it was not uncommon for families to mix their flour with oats, peas, or even ground acorns to stretch their supply until the next harvest. The resulting loaves were dense and hearty, designed not for pleasure but for endurance, slices dipped into stew to soften their texture before being eaten. Water, too, required care. Wells froze, buckets cracked in the cold, and sometimes water had to be melted from ice or snow before cooking even began. A pot of slowly melting snow became a familiar sight by the hearth, and its slow transformation from frozen silence to liquid warmth felt like a small victory. As winter deepened, meals grew smaller. By late February, the dreaded hungry gap, stores thinned visibly, and families began rationing with even greater caution. A single root vegetable might be stretched across 2 meals. A scrap of salted meat that had once flavored a pot generously became an ingredient saved for special occasions. Hunger crept quietly, not as sudden starvation, but as a slow tightening, a knowledge that spring planting was still weeks away, and that every bowl of food required careful thought. Yet even in this period of scarcity, winter meals carried a kind of intimacy. Families gathered close around the pot, sharing warmth and nourishment at the same time, speaking softly as steam rose from simple wooden bowls. The firelight flickered across their faces, reflecting fatigue, hope, and the unspoken understanding that as long as they could share a warm meal, however small, they still had strength enough to face another day of cold. In this way, winter food was more than sustenance. It was memory, discipline, and resilience woven together, a quiet testament to the way medieval life balanced hardship with ingenuity, turning stored grains, dried vegetables, and preserved scraps into a slow, steady rhythm of survival that carried people from the darkest months toward the promise of spring. In winter, medieval families did not simply live alongside their animals. They lived because of them, bound to the quiet strength of cows, sheep, goats, and chickens, in a way that became more visible as the cold pressed closer around the cottage walls. These creatures provided milk, wool, meat, and in a quiet but essential way, warmth itself, a living buffer against the cold that seeped into every corner of the winter world. Caring for them was not merely a duty, but a daily ritual, a slow and deliberate act that shaped the rhythm of each morning and evening. For many households, the barn was not a distant outbuilding, but an extension of the home itself. In regions where the cold was deepest, where nights fell to temperatures that froze water in moments, families often kept their most vulnerable animals inside a portion of the cottage, separated only by a low wooden partition or a woven hurdle. The warmth of a cow or a small flock of sheep drifted gently into the main room, raising the temperature by a few degrees, not enough to make the room truly warm, but enough to soften the cold so that sleep became possible. In the first hours of daylight, the farmer stepped quietly into the barn, lantern in hand, its faint glow illuminating the soft shapes of animals stirring in the straw. Their breath rose in steady white plumes, warm against the frozen air, and the gentle sound of hooves shifting on the ground became a kind of morning music, a reminder that life still persisted in the cold. The cow, heavy with winter coat, would turn her head as he entered, her eyes soft and expectant. The sheep would bleat in low voices, recognizing the familiar sound of footsteps, and even the chickens, puffed into round feathery bundles, clucked softly as if greeting the returning light. Feeding them required not only strength but foresight. Hay had to be distributed carefully, rationed so that the stores would last until spring. A family that miscalculated even slightly risked running out weeks before the grass returned, and losing an animal in winter was more than a financial loss. It was a blow to survival itself. So each flake of hay was shaken loose with deliberate hands, each scoop of grain measured with a practiced eye, and each animal watched closely for signs of illness or fatigue. Winter did not forgive carelessness. Water posed its own challenge. Troughs froze solid overnight, and the surface had to be cracked open each morning with a wooden mallet. Sometimes the ice was so thick, it required several blows before the water beneath could move again. Animals crowded around eagerly, dipping their muzzles into the cold water with a gratitude that felt almost human, their warmth steaming into the frosty air as they drank. Cleaning the barn was another winter ritual. Straw bedding, dampened by moisture and the slow creep of cold, had to be refreshed regularly, not only for comfort but to protect animals from sickness. The smell of warm straw, earthy and familiar, mingled with the scent of wool and the faint sweetness of stored hay, creating an atmosphere far more comforting than the frigid silence outside. But winter care was not only about feeding and cleaning, it was about watchfulness. The farmer checked each animal with slow hands, pressing fingers into thick wool to feel the warmth beneath, examining hooves for cracks caused by the cold, listening to breathing that sometimes shifted in early signs of sickness. A cough from a sheep or a shiver from a cow could mean days of careful nursing, sitting awake beside the animal in the dim barn, tending the fire, speaking in low voices, and doing everything possible to keep illness from taking hold. In return, the animals provided more than food. Their bodies radiated heat into the barn, warming the farmer's hands when he worked close beside them. Their wool and hides became the clothing that wrapped the family at night. Their milk became warm breakfasts stirred slowly near the hearth. And their presence, gentle, steady, patient, offered a quiet companionship, a shared endurance through long months of cold. As the sun reached its highest point, though in winter it barely climbed above the treetops, the farmer often paused in the doorway of the barn, looking out across the snow-covered fields. Behind him, the animals shifted softly, warming the air with their breath. Before him, the landscape lay silent and unbroken, a world resting beneath its mantle of frost. And in these moments it became unmistakably clear that winter survival was not a solitary struggle at all, but a partnership, humans and animals, sharing warmth, sharing labor, and moving together through the cold, as if bound by an unspoken pact written long before any person in the village had been born. For weeks, perhaps months, winter had seemed endless, a great white silence stretching across the land, seeping into every crack of the cottage and settling deep into the bones of those who lived within it. Yet even the hardest winter gives way eventually to small, almost imperceptible signs of change, and medieval people, whose lives depended on noticing such shifts, learned to recognize these subtle markers with a kind of instinctive sensitivity, as though their very breath was attuned to the rhythm of the seasons. It often began with sound. Long before the snow melted or the wind softened, there would come an afternoon when the silence outside felt different, when the sharp, crisp stillness of deep winter carried a faint murmur beneath it, perhaps the distant call of a bird that had been absent for weeks, or the quiet drip of melting ice somewhere on the edge of the roof, a fragile tapping that felt almost like a whispered promise. A child might notice it first, pausing beside the doorway with a puzzled expression, wondering why the air sounded less heavy than it had the day before. Then came the light. On clear mornings the sun lingered a little longer on the horizon, stretching its pale rays across the fields in a way that felt gentler, almost tender, warming the surface of the snow just enough to leave a thin crust of shine. Shadows, too, changed shape, shorter, softer, signaling that the earth was slowly beginning to tilt towards spring, even if the cold still pressed insistently against doors and windows. Inside the cottage, these small changes altered the rhythm of daily life in subtle ways. People moved with slightly less urgency when tending the fire, sensing that the worst of winter might be loosening its grip. The animals seemed to feel it as well. Cows stood closer to the barn door, their breath rising, not in great clouds of white, but in softer wisps. The sheep bleated more frequently as though restless. The chickens scratched the ground beneath the straw with renewed energy, sensing warmth deep within the soil. One of the most telling signs was the smell of earth. After months of deep freeze, a single day of thaw could carry a faint, unmistakable scent, damp soil mixing with melting snow, a breath of the world beneath winter's heavy blanket awakening molecule by molecule. Villagers recognized it instantly. They would pause during chores, lift their heads, breathe deeply, and exchange small, hopeful glances. Spring was not here, not yet, but it was thinking of coming. Paths became slushy, difficult to walk but rich with meaning. Water pooled where snow had begun to shrink back, and icicles hanging from the eaves thinned, dripping steadily in the warmer hours of the afternoon. The roads between cottages, once hard as stone, softened into muddy trails that clung to boots and hems, but no one complained. Mud, after all, meant movement, change, life. Children were always the first to treat the thaw like magic. They poked at the slush with sticks, pressed their hands into the damp snow, and laughed when the icy crust cracked beneath their weight. Their breath no longer felt like frost against their faces, and their cheeks carried a different kind of flush, not the sharp sting of cold, but the gentle warmth of play. Adults, though quieter in their joy, felt hope creeping into their thoughts in small, steady steps. They spoke of preparing the fields, of checking the seed stores, of mending tools for the coming season. Even the meals shifted subtly. More water in the stew, more careful rationing, not because supplies were plentiful, but because the knowledge that warmer days were approaching gave people a renewed patience, a sense that hunger could be endured a little longer. Yet the thaw was never smooth or certain. Medieval people knew that winter often fought back, sending late storms with biting winds that tried to reclaim the land it had held for so long. But once the thaw had begun, once water had touched the earth, once birdsong had returned even faintly, the cycle had shifted. The cold could roar again, but it could not undo the first steps of spring. And so, between the deep freeze and the first green shoot, there lay a season of waiting, a quiet, liminal space, where hope stirred gently beneath the surface of the world, where families looked to the horizon, not with fear but with expectation, and where each small sign of warmth felt like a soft hand reaching through the darkness, guiding them toward the promise of renewal. Even after the first signs of thaw appeared, the dripping icicles, the softened light, the restless murmur of animals sensing change, medieval families knew that winter was not yet finished with them, that the journey out of the cold was slow and uncertain, like walking across a frozen pond whose surface groaned with every step. Early spring was not a season of blossoming and warmth. It was a fragile corridor between danger and survival, a time when the cold still lingered in sudden gusts and shadows, testing the strength of every living thing before releasing its grip entirely. The first true work of the new season began cautiously, as people stepped outside and found the world transformed not into green fields, but into a patchwork of slush, stubborn ice and mud that clung to boots and tools with equal determination. The snow, once smooth and silent, had become uneven and pitted, melting in some places and freezing again in others, creating ridges and hollows that turned familiar paths into unpredictable terrain. Yet despite the mess, there was something comforting in the sound of water trickling along the edges of the road, a soft, persistent murmur that had been absent for months. One of the earliest tasks was checking the condition of the fields. Farmers walked slowly across the muddy ground, feeling the soil with the tips of their boots, noticing where the earth had compacted under winter's weight and where drainage would be needed. The frost still hid beneath the surface in many places, waiting to emerge in the night, but patches of bare earth appeared here and there like shy promises of the work to come. Men knelt and pressed their fingers into the damp soil, testing its texture, its readiness, its softness, examining it with the same tenderness they might show a sleeping child. Fences and hedges, damaged by the weight of snow and the winter winds, had to be repaired. Wooden stakes loosened during the freeze were hammered back into place. Woven branches that marked property lines were tightened and reinforced. These small acts of maintenance were not merely practical. They were symbolic, small gestures that signaled the land was awakening, that the boundaries of life and labor were becoming clear again after months spent hidden beneath frost. Near the cottages, the earlier signs of green appeared not in the fields but in unexpected places. Tiny shoots poking through patches of melting snow near stone walls where the sun lingered longer, or delicate herbs that had clung stubbornly to life beneath the shelter of a fallen branch. Children were often the first to discover them, calling out in soft, excited voices, kneeling to touch the fragile leaves as though afraid they might vanish at the slightest breath. The work with animals also shifted. Instead of focusing solely on feeding and survival, families began preparing for lambing and calving, tasks that demanded gentleness, sleepless nights, and a readiness to act quickly in cold barns, where new life entered the world alongside the last echoes of winter. The cries of newborn animals carried a different kind of warmth, a reminder that the cycle of seasons, however harsh, always returned to renewal. Inside homes, people sorted their dwindling supplies, calculating how long the remaining barrels of grain and root vegetables would last, knowing that early spring was often the leanest time of all. The hungry gap, as they called it, stretched before them like a thin line of uncertainty. Yet the crackling of melting snow dripping from rooftops offered a quiet reassurance. Spring might be late, but it was inevitable. Villagers met more often outdoors, wrapped in cloaks, but standing together without the urgency of winter's cold biting at their faces. They spoke of planting, of which seeds had survived storage, of which tools needed sharpening, of whose plough needed mending, and of when it might be safe to bring animals out of the barn for longer hours. Their conversations carried a tone of cautious optimism, not the joy of true spring, but the slow uncoiling of hope after months of constraint. The village felt lighter, even if the air remained chilled. Smoke rose more lazily from chimneys, and the fires inside homes were tended less frantically. Lanterns hung outside doors flickered more gently in the wind, less threatened by the cold. The world had not yet warmed, but it had softened as though winter itself were growing tired. And so, step by careful step, medieval life emerged from the harshest season, not with sudden colour or warmth, but with the slow, deliberate return of work, movement, and intention, a shared understanding that even in the coldest economies of survival, the earth always, eventually, remembered how to breathe again. As the last icy grip of winter loosened just enough for the soil to breathe again, the village began to sense a shift not only in the air but in its own heartbeat, a subtle quickening that quietly encouraged people to look outward toward the fields with a mixture of caution and anticipation. Early spring was not yet warm. The wind still carried the chill of distant frost, but the earth beneath it had begun its slow, determined thaw, softening layer by thin layer until it could once again accept the first tools of the farming year. Ploughing was the great labor of early spring, and it began with a kind of reverence, as though the villagers understood they were asking the tired earth to wake before it was fully ready. The plough itself, stored all winter in the barn beside the animals, was brought out with care and inspected in the cold morning light. Its wooden frame, swollen from the damp, needed tightening. Its iron blade, dulled by the previous year's stones, had to be sharpened patiently by hand over a whetstone. Every adjustment was deliberate, because a faulty plough meant wasted strength, and in early spring no one could afford to squander energy. The oxen, those slow, patient creatures that carried the weight of both winter's survival and spring's labor, were led from the barn with gentle hands. Their thick winter coats had begun to shed, leaving patches of softer hair beneath, and their breath rose in quiet streams as they walked, heavy and steady toward the waiting fields. They understood the harness not as restraint but as purpose, leaning into it with practiced familiarity as the farmer fastened the wooden yoke across their broad shoulders. When the ploughing began, the sound was like a low murmur spreading across the land, the scrape of iron against thawing soil, the creak of wood strained by weight, the rhythmic clomp of oxen hooves pressing into the ground with each determined step. The farmer walked behind, guiding the plough with strong, steady hands, his boots sinking into the softened earth as furrows formed in long, dark ribbons behind him. Each strip of freshly turned soil carried the scent of life held dormant through months of ice, an earthy richness that rose into the crisp air like a promise. This early ploughing was not done in haste. The ground was uneven, half frozen in places, muddy in others, and each furrow required patience. Sometimes the plough snagged on roots or stones revealed by the melting snow, and the farmer had to stop, kneel, and root them out with numb fingers before continuing. Yet even these interruptions were met with quiet acceptance, because this was the ancient rhythm of the land, slow, deliberate, cyclical, and every obstacle once cleared made the path smoother for the seeds that would soon follow. Around the farmer, the village stirred gently to life. Women carried baskets of tools and seed sacks to the edges of the fields, inspecting their contents with careful eyes, ensuring that nothing spoiled during winter. Children, finally free from the confinement of frozen yards and dim cottages, ran along the edges of the ploughed rows, their boots splashing in shallow pools of meltwater. Their laughter, carried on the cool breeze, felt like one of spring's earliest blessings. The elders watched with a mix of pride and concern, remembering past seasons when the thaw came too early or too late, when spring storms ruined the first tender shoots, or when the soil stayed frozen so long that the harvest failed. Their knowledge, distilled through decades of winters and springs, guided when to begin, when to pause, and when to trust the weather enough to move from ploughing to planting. By midday, the sun hovered just high enough to soften the air, and the scent of freshly turned soil drifted across the fields like a reminder that life was returning 1 inch at a time. The oxen, after hours of labor, were led back to rest, steam rising from their flanks, and the farmer stood quietly at the edge of the field for a moment, looking over the uneven rows carved into the landscape, feeling the tentative but undeniable shift from endurance to creation. There was still cold in the wind, still frost waiting in the shadows, still a long path ahead before the world turned green again. But as the first day of ploughing ended, the land itself seemed to whisper a reassurance that winter's silence was over, that movement had returned, and that the long, slow pulse of the farming year had begun once more, tying people and earth together in the ancient, unbroken partnership that had sustained them through every season. Once the first furrows had been carved into the dark spring soil, and the oxen had traced their slow, powerful paths across the fields, the village turned its attention toward the next great act of renewal, the sowing of seeds, a task as delicate as it was essential, carried out with quiet reverence in the cool air of early spring. This was the moment when hope became something physical, held in the hands of every farmer and gently scattered across the land that had slept for so long beneath winter's heavy shroud. Seed sacks, preserved carefully through the cold months, were brought from their hiding places in lofts and storerooms, each one tied with cord or leather to protect it from moisture and pests. Inside were the treasures of the coming season: barley, oats, rye, sometimes wheat, and small handfuls of legumes that would enrich the soil while feeding the family in months to come. Each seed was tiny, so small it seemed almost impossible that something so fragile could anchor an entire year's survival. Yet medieval people understood better than anyone how much power rested inside those little grains. The act of sowing began with a moment of stillness. Farmers stood at the edge of the field, releasing a soft breath that hung in the cool air, their hands resting on the familiar weight of the seed sack slung across the shoulder. They scanned the sky, gauging the wind with a sensitivity that came not from instruments but from countless years of watching the weather shift like a living creature. A gust too strong could scatter seeds where they did not belong. Too calm a day might leave the ground too damp to receive them. When the moment felt right, not perfect, never perfect, but right, they stepped into the field. Walking in slow, measured strides, the farmer dipped a hand into the sack and lifted a small handful of seeds, letting them rest against the warm skin of the palm for a brief instant before scattering them in a wide, practiced arc. The movement, smooth and familiar, was learned in childhood and perfected across decades. The sweep of the arm, the release of the fingers, the soft rain of seeds falling across the dark, furrowed earth. The seeds landed quietly, barely making a sound, settling into the grooves carved days earlier, disappearing one by one into the damp soil where the cold still lingered beneath the surface. The sowing was slow and meditative, a kind of walking prayer offered to the land. Each handful carried hope. Each scattering of seeds traced a promise from the farmer to the earth. If you wake, if you grow, if you give us even a modest harvest, we will make it through another year. And the earth, in its own time, responded, not immediately, not quickly, but with a patient certainty that had guided the rhythm of human life for thousands of years. Women followed behind with rakes or branches bundled together, gently covering the seeds with a thin veil of soil. Their movements were soft, almost tender, smoothing the earth so that birds would not steal the seed, and that spring rain would settle evenly across the field. Children, too, walked among them, carrying small bundles of straw or shaking tin bells to frighten away crows, a game to the little ones, but a necessity to the adults who watched the skies anxiously for hungry flocks. As the morning passed into afternoon, the fields slowly transformed. The furrows that had once looked raw and exposed now held the first traces of a new beginning, hidden beneath the surface but present all the same. Villagers paused at the edge of the land, looking over the field with a quiet satisfaction. Nothing visible had changed. The earth looked the same as before, yet they felt different, lighter, as though the act of laying their hope into the soil had shifted something inside them. Sowing was not only a task, it was a surrender, a release of control. Once the seeds were in the ground, all they could do was wait, watch the sky, pray for gentle rains and mild days, and trust the land to awaken in its own time. This patience defined medieval life, a rhythm built not on rushing but on endurance, steady hands, and the soft acceptance that nature moved at a pace no human could command. By dusk the fields lay quiet again, the last beams of pale sunlight stretching across the soft earth. The farmers walked home slowly, boots heavy with mud, seed sacks nearly empty, their shadows long behind them. The air was cool but no longer biting. The world smelled faintly of thawing soil and distant green, the scent of things beginning, of life preparing to emerge. And inside the cottages, as the hearth glowed and the evening meal simmered over a low fire, people spoke in lowered voices of what they had done that day, their words carried by a gentle mixture of relief, exhaustion, and humble hope. Spring was still fragile, still uncertain, but the seeds were in the ground. The first step toward renewal had been taken, and for a people shaped by winter's harshness, that was enough, more than enough to warm their hearts as night settled once again over the village. Days after the seeds had been sown, the village settled into a slow rhythm of waiting, watching the skies with a hopeful vigilance and listening for the distant rumble of early spring rain. It was a time of fragile patience when nothing visible had changed, yet everyone felt that something fundamental in the world had begun to shift, not in great bursts of colour or warmth, but in delicate, almost secret movements unfolding beneath the soil and in the air that grew a little softer with each passing day. The first rain of spring did not come with the dramatic roar of summer storms. Instead, it arrived as a gentle, persistent drizzle that swept across the fields like a fine veil, darkening the soil in long, soft strokes and making the furrows shine faintly under the muted light. People stepped outside and lifted their faces to it, feeling the cool droplets on their skin and breathing deeply the fresh, earthy scent that rose from the wet ground, a scent of promise, of renewal, of life stretching quietly beneath the surface. For days afterward the world remained grey and still, the fields appearing unchanged to untrained eyes, Yet the villagers knew that beneath that soft blanket of moisture, the seeds were stirring, swelling slightly as they absorbed water, beginning the slow and miraculous process that would split them open from within. Children often knelt at the edge of the fields, brushing aside tiny clumps of soil with curious fingers, hoping to glimpse the first sign of green, though their parents gently reminded them to wait, to let the earth work in its own time. And then, one morning, always unexpectedly, always quietly, the first tiny shoots appeared. They did not rise dramatically from the soil. They simply emerged like thin green threads, fragile and hesitant, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. But once seen, they were impossible to forget. A single shoot meant life had returned, that winter had finally loosened its hold entirely, and that the promise buried in the earth weeks earlier had begun to take shape. Villagers walked slowly through the fields, careful not to disturb the new growth, speaking softly as though afraid that loud voices might break the delicate moment. The shoots, still pale and tender, swayed in the cool morning breeze, their small bodies drinking in the sun that now lingered longer in the sky. Even the wind felt gentler, no longer carrying the sharp bite of frost, but instead brushing across the land like a soft hand smoothing wrinkles from a blanket. Soon, more shoots joined the first, spreading across the furrows in even lines, creating a faint shimmer of green that deepened with each passing day. The fields, once stark and brown after the thaw, began to resemble living tapestries, each row of new growth adding a layer of depth and quiet beauty to the landscape. Birds returned in greater numbers, their songs carrying over the fields like tiny celebrations of spring, and the village buzzed with a cautious but unmistakable sense of renewal. Everywhere one looked, life reawakened. Buds swelled on the branches of fruit trees, their shapes rounded and full despite the lingering chill. Willow branches turned a delicate shade of yellow-green, signaling the approach of leaves. Herbs that had hidden under the snow, thyme, sage, and tiny wild sorrel, pushed upward with surprising determination. And along the edges of cottages where the sun warmed the stones, small purple and white flowers began to bloom, their petals trembling in the breeze, yet glowing with a color that winter had kept hidden for months. Inside homes, the atmosphere changed as well. People moved with a lighter energy. Windows were cracked open to let in the fresh air, and fires were allowed to burn lower during the day. Children spent longer hours outside, chasing each other across the damp fields, their laughter rising into the sky like the clearing of the last winter storm. Even the animals sensed the change. Cows lingered near the pasture gate, sheep bleated with impatience for the open fields, and chickens pecked eagerly at the new greenery sprouting in corners of the yard. The village, once muted under winter's deep silence, now pulsed softly with movement and sound. The world was waking, not in a rush but in a slow, steady unfolding, and every villager, from the oldest elder to the youngest child, felt the quiet joy of watching life return in the smallest, simplest forms. And in these tender early days of spring, there was a collective understanding, unspoken but shared by all, that the hardest part of the year was behind them, and that the earth, faithful to its ancient rhythm, had begun its slow transformation from survival to growth once again. And so as the fields slowly shifted from faint green threads to soft blankets of growing color, as the days stretched a little farther with each sunrise, and as the cold retreated inch by inch into the shaded corners of forests and riverbanks, the long cycle of medieval winter finally came to its gentle close, leaving behind not only the memory of hardship, but the quiet understanding that survival had never belonged to fire alone, nor to food, nor to shelter, but to the steady, patient resilience of ordinary people who learned to bend with the seasons rather than break beneath them. Looking back across the months of darkness, it became clear that winter had shaped everything. The way families slept close together beneath woolen blankets, the way embers were nursed through the deepest nights, the way neighbors gathered in warm rooms to share food and stories, the way animals breathed warmth into barns and cottages, and the way every soul in the village moved with caution, gratitude and care through a world held still by frost. Winter was not merely endured, it taught in its own silent way the value of community, of patience, of resourcefulness, and of those small acts of kindness that kept people alive when wood was scarce, and the nights seemed impossibly long. The thaw that followed did not erase the memory of cold, but it softened it, turning it into something almost sacred, a reminder of the strength hidden in simplicity, of the warmth found in companionship, and of the way the human spirit quietly adapts to whatever the earth demands. Medieval people did not survive winter because they were stronger than us, but because they lived in harmony with the rhythms of the land, accepting its challenges and answering them with humility rather than resistance. As spring deepened, cottages opened their doors to sunlight, smoke drifted more lazily from hearths that now burned less urgently, and families stepped into the fields not as survivors emerging from darkness, but as caretakers returning to the soil that would nourish them once again. The world, once silent beneath layers of snow, now hummed softly with birdsong, the bleating of lambs, the rustle of new leaves, and the gentle murmur of people moving through a season of work rather than endurance. And in this shifting landscape, part memory, part renewal, lingered the quiet truth at the heart of every medieval winter, that no matter how long the cold held the land, no matter how bitter the nights or how scarce the fuel, warmth always returned, life always stirred again, and hope, however small or fragile it appeared, always found its way through the frost. In the end, winter was never the enemy. It was a teacher, shaping lives, shaping communities, and shaping the very stories that would be whispered for generations beside fires that glowed like tiny suns in the heart of even the humblest cottage. And though centuries have passed, and the world has changed beyond recognition, that lesson remains, a soft reminder from a distant time that resilience is not loud or dramatic, but quiet, patient and steady, like a peat ember kept alive through the coldest night, waiting for the moment when it can rise once more into flame.